Constructivism is often misunderstood as a new wave of idealism or simply disregarded as a loose theory. In your opinion, what are the strengths and weaknesses of constructivism?
Well, let me first answer on the first line, whether it's idealism or not. I think there are obviously there are some people who call themselves constructivists who would be liberal, hoping in, believing in progress, and therefore could be considered idealists. This is not necessary for constructivism, the lecture before, but the idea behind constructivism is not that there are only ideas out there. Indeed, the very distinction between ideas and matter is not something they think is necessarily very helpful, because much of the matter which matters to us matters only for the ideas we have about it. So I think it is not necessary to be idealist, but some of them are, just as some realists are actually quite liberal in their political opinions. A loose theory, you are right, in the sense that constructivism is not trying to have a positivist way of doing theory, but more an interpretivist way of theory. Now, some people would call it loose, some others would call it the only thing we can do in the social world we have. The strength and weaknesses, I think it's young, and by being young it has some of its basic concepts which are not yet sufficiently analyzed. I think that the central concept of foreign policy identity is one which is intriguing, but perhaps not so easy as many constructivists would like to think. I think its strength is that the meta-theoretical setting is much more stable, the foundations are better, and for me that the understanding of the international society is better, thicker than the usual understanding of just state-to-state relations.
Is constructivism applicable to the real world? In other words, how would constructivists interpret and respond to the current changes in the international environment, such as the Arab Spring or the rise of China?
Of course it's applicable to the real world. There are by now zillions of books of empirical studies which are informed by constructivism, and there is no problem about that one. Again, this is based upon this idea that this is old-fashioned idealism and so on, which is entirely wrong. The question about how they would answer China's rise or the Arab Spring, the first answer would very probably be that in order to understand this you have to know those regions much better. Because if it is true that we have to understand particular foreign policy identities, or if you have to understand indeed how the political systems within a country has to work, the self-understandings that maybe particular people have of themselves, nations have of themselves, then the kind of easy analysis from the table and desk in which basically people have not much of a sense of what is going on in the region would simply not be possible. This might be sometimes possible for security studies which are basically just on the balance of power. Power you can measure, it's all what you need. You don't need to understand any of the cultural differences there are. So the first way to do is they would respond by meeting people who know what is going on the ground. Parts of the story would be about struggles of recognition. As I said before, identity is a very important issue in constructivist theorizing. So one of the major conflictual areas is when recognition, the outside recognition of who you are and the way that you need or want to be recognized to the outside might not necessarily coincide. So one of the research areas in which that would go would, for instance, be about the politics of recognition of particular parts of the world. And for instance, for China, that could be one of the issues.
Compared to other theories, as you mentioned, constructivism is relatively young. How do you see the future of constructivism and its contribution to the theoretical debate in international relations?
Well, that depends where you are talking about. It is young, but it's almost dominant in several parts of Europe. It has informed before its name several of the foreign policies, like the German Ostpolitik. It is not so dominant in the US, and it's almost non-existing in some of the newer academia in Central Eastern Europe or elsewhere, where this kind of thinking doesn't yet make it, so to speak. So the contribution it will make will be different in all these different environments. In some of them it will be basically the kind of initial ploy, making the taken for granted and natural, what we consider to be almost there, without further interpretation, no longer look so natural and taken for granted, and look at why it has come to be the way it is, why particular categories the pariah, the terrorist, and so on have been applied at that point in time, why not in others, and so on. And so it would open up for constructivist theorizing. But in Europe, where it is now for 20 years done a lot, the debate is really about the conceptual fine-tuning.
Professor Guzzini, thank you very much.
You're welcome.